We receive many strange things at the coroner's office, but what leaves the deepest mark isn't always what appears most violent at first glance. This case began so ordinarily that no one could have imagined where it would lead us, into what dark corners of human existence it would pull us. That particular day, my shift started at 7 in the morning. The sky still holding on to the last traces of darkness. I was already in the locker room, changing into my scrubs, when the radio crackled to life with news that transport was coming in from the capital. 3 bodies. Same incident. By itself, this wasn't unusual in our line of work. Multiple victim car accidents. House fires that consume entire families. Tragedies that strike without warning. These things happen with a frequency that would shock most people. What caught everyone's attention, what made the room go quiet for just a moment, was that there was no record of external violence on any of the 3 victims. The description that came through the protocol was clinical, almost sterile in its brevity. Family found lifeless in residence. No apparent signs of struggle or trauma. No broken windows or forced entry. Nothing that screamed out for immediate answers. I signed the intake log and walked down the cold hallway to the unloading area, my footsteps echoing in the early morning stillness. The transport vehicle was already backed up to the bay, its engine still ticking as it cooled. The bodies arrived in black bags, sealed tight, each one bearing a temporary identification tag. Adult male, adult female, child male. The transport team made it clear there was no immediate police urgency, no forensic investigator accompanying the bodies, just the removal assistants doing their job with practiced efficiency. This usually means the scene has already been cleared and released. That, for the initial investigation at least, nothing indicated an obvious crime. No smoking gun or blood-splattered walls. The procedure is always the same, regardless of the circumstances. Reception, verification of seals, notation of incident numbers, the careful documentation that forms the foundation of everything that follows. We conducted the external visual check without opening the bags yet, following protocol to the letter. Then we wheeled them to the cold chamber. 3 drawers side by side. A family still together, even in death. It's a silent place, save for the constant hum of the compressor, a sound that becomes so familiar you stop hearing it after a while. Those who aren't accustomed to it find it eerie, unsettling. But for us, it's simply routine, the background noise of our daily work. At the start of the shift, the priority was organizing the order of the day's autopsies. A morbid kind of scheduling that we've all grown numb to. We had 4 other pending cases waiting. But since these 3 came from the same address, from the same mysterious circumstance, we decided to open them together. This makes things easier, more efficient, because any pattern observed can be documented across all 3 simultaneously. Connections made that might otherwise be missed. In the autopsy room, the routine always begins with external inspection. The careful cataloging of what can be seen before we look deeper. The father appeared to be in his mid-40s. Fair skin, no marks of violence, uniform cadaveric coloration, lividity, fixed in regions consistent with having lain on his back. No wounds, no bruises, no burns. Nothing that told a story of his final moments. The mother showed similar characteristics. Pale skin, the same coloration, the same pattern of lividity, settling where gravity had pulled the blood. The boy, around 8 years old, also bore no external injuries. His small body unmarked by the violence that so often claims the young. Up to that point, the hypothesis everyone was quietly discussing was a gas leak. Carbon monoxide poisoning, perhaps. I've seen several cases like that over the years. People who go to sleep and never wake up, breathing in the silent killer until their bodies simply give out. But right away, looking at the coloration, something didn't fit the pattern we expected. The characteristic rosy tone that carbon monoxide leaves behind wasn't present at all. Instead, there was a more uniform paleness, a color that spoke of something else entirely, something we couldn't yet name. After the external inspection, we moved to weighing and measuring, recording height, weight, checking their clothing for any clues they might offer. They were dressed in clean sleepwear, nothing torn or stained, the fabric speaking of a normal night that turned into something unthinkable. The boy was wearing cotton pajamas with a faded print, the adults in light t-shirts and loose pants. the kind of comfortable clothing people choose when they think they're safe in their own home. There were no signs of vomit on the clothes, which is common in acute poisonings when the body tries desperately to expel whatever's killing it. While the team made their notations, filling out forms with practiced precision, I prepared the table for the opening, for the moment when we would begin to search for answers inside these bodies. Fresh gloves, sharp scalpel, paper rolls for cleanup, numbered containers for specimen collection. All the tools of our trade laid out in careful order. The 3 reports would be assembled in parallel, which means we would open one, document everything we found, then move to another, maintaining the same rhythm and attention to detail. This method helps us compare organs and conditions at the same stage of examination, to see patterns that might reveal what happened in that house. The thoracic opening followed standard procedure. Movements I've performed so many times they've become almost automatic. Medium build, separation of skin and muscle layers, sawing through the sternum, revealing the chest cavity and the organs within. The lungs showed slight congestion, but nothing like the intense edema you expect in cases of chemical asphyxiation. None of the fluid-filled tissue that tells of a desperate fight for oxygen. The heart appeared normal. No visible abnormalities. No dangerous enlargement. No significant plaque buildup that might explain a sudden cardiac event. We performed the removal and weighing of each organ, recording everything on our intake sheets, building a picture one measurement at a time. The abdomen also showed no striking alterations. Nothing that jumped out as obviously wrong. Liver intact and healthy looking. Spleen normal in size and color. Kidneys without deformities. Everything seemingly within the expected range for apparently healthy individuals who should have had years ahead of them. What really caught our attention only began to reveal itself when we moved to examining the stomach, that hollow organ that holds the last meals, the final taste of life. Have you ever wondered what secrets our bodies keep? What final truths they hold even after our consciousness has faded, even after we've left this world behind? ... Does it frighten you to think that our last actions, our last choices, might be preserved in such intimate detail, waiting to tell a story we never wanted told? Normally in gastric examination, we observe the contents carefully, noting whether the food is recent or partially dead, whether there's a characteristic odor of alcohol that might explain impairment, whether there is a presence of recognizable substances like pills or identifiable foods that paint a picture of final hours. In the father's case, upon opening the stomach, there was no strong smell of fermentation, no characteristic odor of common poisonings that we've learned to recognize over countless examinations. The contents consisted of a pasty mass, grayish in color, with no definite odor that we could place. Nothing that fit any category we knew. It didn't resemble any type of common food we'd ever encountered. It didn't have the appearance of any homemade mixture or meal preparation. The strangest thing, what made us all pause and exchange glances, was that the consistency was completely uniform, as if it had been processed before, being ingested, ground down, or blended into something unnatural. There were no pieces, no fibers, no residues that indicated meat, vegetables, or any domestic preparation we could recognize. It was a smooth paste, thick and almost sticky, something that seemed designed rather than cooked. I collected the sample in the proper container for forwarding to the toxicology laboratory, sealing it carefully, knowing it might hold the answer to what happened to this family. In the mother's stomach, we found the same thing. The same color that seemed to absorb light. The same consistency that clung to our instruments. The same absence of any identifying odor. The quantity was also similar, just over 200 milliliters, enough to fill a small glass. It was already clear this wasn't coincidence, that whatever this substance was, it had been consumed by both adults. But we followed protocol without speculating aloud, keeping our observations clinical and measured. I invite you to share in the comments a statement that begins with "I recognize that ... about something in your own life that you've been reluctant to see. Clearly, some truth that's been waiting for your acknowledgement. Sometimes the most profound transformations begin when we simply admit what we've been avoiding, when we stop running from the uncomfortable truths that follow us like shadows. Your recognition, spoken aloud, even in written form, becomes a witness to your own journey, a marker on the path toward understanding that others walking similar roads might need to see. When we reached the boy, when we opened that small stomach that should have been filled with the remnants of a child-estin of the gastric, contents were identical, but there was one detail that made the room feel colder. Part of this paste was still present in the region of the pharynx, in his throat, as if it had been ingested shortly before death claimed him, as if he'd been in the very act of swallowing when his life ended. This is something that immediately draws attention in our field, because it indicates a very close time frame between ingestion and death. Minutes, perhaps, maybe only seconds. The external examination had shown no signs of physical restraint. Nothing to suggest he'd been forced. No marks on his arms, wrists, or around his mouth, where someone might have held him. Everything indicated he had swallowed this substance, without physical resistance, without being held down or compelled through violence. Even so, the presence of that substance still in his throat was uncommon, especially without any signs of choking or the reflexive struggle that comes when something blocks the airway. We closed the first stage of the examination with the collection of samples for toxicology, carefully labeling each container, each piece of evidence that might explain what no one wanted to believe. We forwarded them with the initial classification: unidentified substance, possible simultaneous ingestion. 3 victims from the same household. For now, the protocol continued its measured pace. But internally, we all knew this wasn't something we saw every day. This wasn't routine despite our attempts to treat it as such. You learn in this profession that you won't always get answers, that some cases remain mysteries that haunt you for years. But when it's an entire family, when it's parents and a child, the pressure to provide an explanation becomes almost unbearable. The weight of unanswered questions pressing down on everyone involved. On the same day, after we closed the bodies and restored them to something resembling the people they once were, the samples were sent to the toxicology laboratory. This is always done in properly sealed containers, with labels that include the incident number, type of sumplet, and origin. In this case, gastric, contents, and the other fluids we'd collected. We also forwarded blood and urine whenever possible to collect for comprehensive examination, building a complete picture from multiple sources. In the adults, we managed to obtain all 3 standard collections without difficulty. In the boy, due to his young age and the position in which he was found, there was minimal urine, his small body having already begun shutting down before we arrived. The results don't come immediately, don't provide instant answers to the questions that echo in the silence. The laboratory takes at minimum 24 to 48 hours for a preliminary report, sometimes longer if what they find requires additional testing or consultation. Until then, what we had was only visual description and photographic documentation of the contents. Images that would be filed away in folders that might never be opened again. In the medical examiner's room, between one case and another as the day wore on, the subject kept returning like a persistent ghost. Everyone who was on shift knew that gray paste didn't resemble anything we'd encountered before in all our years of experience. All the stomachs we'd opened and examined. It wasn't like powdered poison dissolved in liquid, which usually leaves visible residue or crystals that catch the light. It also didn't resemble infant formula or liquid supplements, which have distinctive smells and colors, textures that speak of their commercial origins. From a medical legal standpoint, without an identified substance, without knowing what that paste actually was, we couldn't definitively declare intoxication as the cause of death. And without compatible internal injuries, without damage to organs or tissues that told a clear story, there was no other obvious mechanism of death we could point to with certainty. In other words, the report would depend almost entirely on what the laboratory found, on whether their instruments and tests could name what we couldn't, whether science could provide answers where observation had failed us. 2 days later, the partial report arrived, delivered in the routine way that belied the mystery it contained. I read the document right there at the same counter where we had received the bodies, standing under the fluorescent lights that never quite feel warm enough. The basic analysis for common toxins, the standard panel we run on every case, came back negative across the board for all 3 victims. No alcohol in their systems, no illicit drugs coursing through their veins, no pesticides, no controlled medications that might explain their sudden departure from this world. There were no detectable heavy metals poisoning their cells, no solvents burning through their tissues, no known alkaloids that we could point to and say, here, this is what killed them. This is what ended 3 lives in one night. What appeared in the report was practically a repetition of what we had already written in our initial description. The same words rearranged but offering no new illumination. Pasty material, grayish coloration, non-characteristic odor. Chemical composition not identified in standard panel. In other words, We hadn't advanced at all, hadn't moved one step closer to understanding what had happened in that house. When this happens, when the standard tests fail to provide answers, the recommendation is to send samples for more advanced analysis, which usually goes to the capital city to a central laboratory equipped with mass spectrometry and other sophisticated instruments that can peer deeper into the molecular structure of unknown substances. We made the referral, filled out the necessary forms, and packaged the remaining samples with care. But we already knew it would take weeks, maybe even months, depending on their backlog. Meanwhile, the police investigation needed a provisional report, something official they could attach to their files, even if it said almost nothing. The document we prepared read simply and maddeningly: death by undetermined cause. Possible simultaneous ingestion of unidentified substance is the most precise and, at the same time, the vaguest statement that exists in our field. A confession of ignorance dressed in professional language. Sometimes in these cases, family members appear seeking information, desperate for answers, or they come to claim the body and begin the painful process of saying goodbye. That's not what happened here, and the absence of anyone asking about them felt almost as strange as the deaths themselves. No relative called. No one showed up at our doors asking questions or demanding to know what had taken their loved ones. We checked with the civil police, hoping they might have contact. Information we were missing, and the response was chilling in its simplicity. There had been no contact from close relatives, and the address listed on the incident report was now unoccupied, abandoned as if the family had been erased, not just from life, but from the very records of existence. It was as if that family had no connections to anyone, no threads binding them to the larger world, no one who would notice or care that they were gone. Internally, some of my colleagues commented on the possibility of food poisoning with an industrial substance, something contaminated or mislabeled that they'd consumed without knowing. But that scenario normally leaves distinctive marks on the organs, visible damage to the digestive tract, and most importantly, it has an odor, a chemical signature that trained noses can recognize. In Turkey's, the odor was practically non-existent, an absence that felt more wrong than any smell could have been. This bothered me more than if we'd found something clearly toxic, something we could name and categorize and file away. The unknown haunts us in ways that the known never can, no matter how terrible. While we waited for the final results, the work continued its relentless pace, as it always does in a place where death never takes a day off. Other bodies arrived on gurneys and in bags. Other autopsies took place on the same tables where we'd examined the family, the rhythms of our profession carrying us forward whether we had answers or not. But whenever I passed by the cold chamber and saw those 3 sealed drawers, I remembered that detail in the boy's throat, that paste still present where it should have been. What if I told you that sometimes the things we unexplain are the ones that change us most deeply? That the unanswered questions shape us more than any revelation ever could. ... Have you considered how the mysteries you carry might be teaching you something about acceptance? About living with uncertainty in a world that demands definitive answers for everything, even when none exist. It's rare to see food residue so close to the trachea without signs of aspiration, without the telltale evidence of choking or struggling for breath. And still there was no foam, no fluid backing up into the airways, no marks on the surrounding tissue that indicated suffocation or the desperate fight for oxygen that accompanies it. The boy's body told a story of quiet acceptance, not violent death, and that somehow made it worse. Write in the comments a personal truth beginning with "I have learned that ... double quotes about a moment when you had to accept not having all the answers, when you had to sit with uncertainty and let it teach you something about yourself or the world." Sharing these moments of realization connects us across the distances that separate our individual experiences. Reminds us that we're all navigating the same fundamental questions about existence and meaning. Your story might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today. The permission they need to stop demanding certainty from a universe that rarely provides it. 1 week later, the response from the central laboratory finally arrived in my inbox, appearing with a quiet ping that I almost missed. I opened the email on the chief's computer, my hands hovering over the keyboard as if hesitating might somehow change what I was about to read. The document was short, brutally so, just a few lines that said everything and nothing at once. Complementary analysis did not identify any known substance in the material analyzed. Samples insufficient for deeper analyses. Result inconclusive. Basically nothing. No answers, No breakthrough, no moment of clarity that would let us close this case with confidence. In the coroner's office protocol, when the cause of death isn't determined even after toxicological examination, even after we've done everything our science can do, we close the case as death by undetermined cause. It's frustrating in a way that never quite fades, no matter how many times you encounter it, but it happens more often than the public realizes. The problem is that in this case, we had 3 people dead on the same day, in the same house, with the same substance in their stomachs. 3 lives ended by something we couldn't identify, and even with all of that, there was no explanation we could offer to anyone who might have cared. After the final report was filed, the flow continued, as it always does, bureaucratic and impersonal, moving toward release and disposal, with no family to claim them, with no one standing up to say these people mattered to someone. Their destiny was already written. Burial as indigent persons in a public cemetery. A pauper's grave with no marker bearing their names. This process is cold, mechanical, stripped of any sentiment that might make it feel human. You prepare an official letter, place the body in a simple pine coffin, note the grave number in the ledger, and that's it. That's all the ceremony they get. In the shift following the burial, one of the assistants commented, almost in a tone of confession, as if he needed to say it aloud to make it real, that he had never seen an entire family buried without anyone showing up, not even to ask questions, not even to stand at the graveside for a moment. But the conversation didn't go forward from there, didn't develop into anything deeper. At the coroner's office, certain subjects die in the hallway before they can reach any kind of resolution, killed by the weight of too many other deaths demanding our attention. The case record was archived like all the others, filed away in drawers that hold thousands of stories that will never be fully told. In my desk drawer, I kept a copy of the report, not because it was forbidden to do so, but because it bothered me not having an answer, not being able to close that mental file the way we'd closed the physical one. The description was dry and clinical, listing the weight of organs in grams, noting the absence of lesions in technical language, documenting gastric contents that defied identification. Not a single line gave any hint of who these people had been when they were alive, what they dreamed about, what had brought them to that house, or why they had died there together. After the burial, the subject simply vanished from our daily routine, disappeared like morning fog when the sun rises. There was no follow-up from the investigation, no additional examination requests that might shed new light, no detective visits asking to review the findings one more time. Inti system, both digital and bureaucratic. The case was listed as closed, stamped with finality that felt premature but official, and for the institution, for the machinery of death investigation that grinds on regardless, that's sufficient. That's all that's required. In the days that followed, I still passed by the cold chamber multiple times per shift, and by habit, by some compulsion I couldn't quite name, I would glance at the space where those 3 drawers had been. They were occupied now by other bodies from other cases, new mysteries replacing old ones. Here the rotation is constant and unforgiving, a reminder that death never pauses or waits for us to catch up. What leaves today is replaced tomorrow, sometimes within hours. But that family remained in my memory in a different way, carved deeper than most cases, refusing to fade into the background noise of countless deaths that I've witnessed and documented over the years. The memory that stayed with me was onto their faces, or the moment we opened them on the table. Wasn't the clinical details that usually lodge themselves in a medical examiner's mind. It was the substance itself, that gray paste, smooth and featureless, without scent or character, still clinging to the boy's throat like it was waiting for something. There was no way to forget it, because it didn't resemble anything I'd ever encountered before in all my years of examining the dead. Didn't fit into any category or classification we'd been trained to recognize. With time, I noticed that no one else mentioned the case anymore, as if it had been collectively erased from our shared memory. It's common for one professional or another to bring up unusual stories. Months later, during slow shifts, swapping tailies over coffee like fishermen, but this time, not a word, not a whisper, nothing. It was as if everyone had decided, without ever discussing it, that it wasn't worth talking about, that some mysteries are better left unspoken and buried with their victims. The last time I had direct contact with their files was weeks afterward, when I needed to access the archive to check another report for a different case entirely. I passed by their names, lined up side by side in the alphabetical listing, each one with its own case number, each one bearing the same phrase that says everything and nothing. death by undetermined cause. I closed the archive cabinet with more force than necessary and returned to my shift, pushing the thoughts away where they couldn't distract me from the work that never stops coming. More bodies arrived that day, as they always do. More examinations were conducted on the same tables, the same instruments cutting into different flesh. At the coroner's office, there's no space to remain stuck on a single case. At least, not officially. Not in any way that shows in your performance reviews or daily reports. But even today, years removed from that strange family and their gray paste, when someone asks me what was the strangest case I've ever handled, I think of them immediately. And it's not because of what we saw, not because of the physical evidence we collected and documented. It's because of what we couldn't explain, what slipped through all our scientific methods and left us standing there with empty hands and unanswered questions. We closed their bodies, sutured the Y incisions we'd made to look inside, signed the reports with our official stamps, and that was it. Case closed in the eyes of the system that demands closure whether we've found truth or not. I always tell new people who come to work here that the coroner's office is the kind of place where you only think you've seen everything until the next shift begins. Until the next body arrives with something that defies every expectation you thought you had. And on that particular night, I learned that lesson in the most visceral way possible, in a way that would make me question the very boundary between life and death. It was Friday, early evening, the time when the day's shift bleeds into night and the city begins its weekend transformation. I had clocked in at 7 p.m., already warned by the departing staff that the shift was going to be heavy, that I should prepare myself for a long night. Friday is always like this in our line of work, a guaranteed flood of tragedy and carelessness. Accidents from people driving too fast or too drunk, police incidents that end with bullets and blood, transfers from hospitals where patients have finally given up their fight. And when you combine all of that into one 12-hour period, the flow never stops, never even slows down enough to catch your breath. The coroner's office in the capital city where I work isn't small by any measure, handles hundreds of cases every month, but it lives perpetually at the edge of its capacity, always one major incident away from being completely overwhelmed. The cold chambers rarely have an empty slot, rarely offer the luxury of space between the dead. Have you ever stopped to consider how thin the line is between being here and being gone? How fragile the boundary that separates the living from the dead, how easily we could slip from one side to the other without even realizing it. What would it mean to you if that boundary wasn't as clear as we've always believed? If the moment of death wasn't a single point, but rather a gradual fading that takes longer than any clock could measure? As soon as I arrived, I walked straight past the internal reception area and headed for the report room, bypassing the usual small talk that helps some people ease into a shift with death. I always begin by checking what's already come in and what's on the way, getting a mental map of the night ahead and how to prioritize the work that needs doing, sharing the comments something beginning with "I transform ... double quotes," about how you've changed your relationship with uncertainty or the unknown aspects of existence. These declarations of transformation, spoken into the collective space we share here, become beacons for others who are still struggling to find their way through similar darkness. Your willingness to name how you've been changed might give someone else the courage to begin their own transformation, to stop resisting the changes that life demands of them. The necropsy technician found me in the corridor, approaching with 2 intake forms clutched in his hand like evidence of crimes he couldn't quite prove. 2 from the municipal hospital, he said, already extending them toward me before I could even ask. They arrived together, came in on the same transport. I took the forms and scanned them quickly, my eyes trained to extract the essential information from bureaucratic language. The first victim was a man, 63 years old, with a documented history of hypertension and diabetes, the usual suspects in cases like his. He was listed as a victim of cardiorespiratory arrest, his heart and lungs simply deciding they'd had enough. The second was a woman, only 27 years old, with her whole life supposedly ahead of her, involved in a traffic accident that resulted in multiple trauma, her body broken by impact and velocity. Both came with death certificates already signed by the hospital staff, emergency intake forms properly attached, times carefully noted in neat handwriting. The documentation was in order, everything filed and stamped as protocol demands. At the municipal hospital, when a death isn't considered natural, even if it happens inside the facility with doctors present, the body is sent to the coroner's office for legal autopsy. It's protocol, non-negotiable. And in these cases, we received the body already with the initial declaration completed by the hospital physician. It's not the definitive death certificate that families need for burials and legal matters, but it's the base document for entry into our system. The first official acknowledgement that someone has died. The man's intake form read like countless others I'd seen. Patient found in cardiopulmonary arrest. CPAP maneuvers performed without success. Absence of central pulse. Absence of respiratory movements for more than 2 minutes. Cardiac auscultation revealed no sounds, pupils fixed and dilated. Time of death 5:12 p.m. Signed and stamped with the authority of medical certainty. The transport was handled by the hospital's own removal service, a team that makes this journey multiple times every day. They arrive, unload the bodies with practiced efficiency, deliver the paperwork, sign the transfer protocol, and move on to the next pickup. It's a process that's quick and almost automatic, stripped of any ceremony or acknowledgement of the person who once inhabited that flesh. That night, exactly as I'd expected, given the Friday rush, there was no immediate vacancy in the cold chambers where we prefer to store bodies. Until examination, the young woman from the accident was given priority and taken to the one available drawer, her broken body sliding into refrigerated darkness. The man was left on a gurney inside the autopsy room itself, covered with a white sheet that turned him into just another anonymous shape, awaiting his turn in a queue he couldn't escape. This happens frequently when we're overwhelmed, more often than the public would be comfortable knowing. It's not ideal by any professional standard, but it's what we can manage when demand exceeds our capacity to process the dead at the speed they arrive. After they were positioned and logged into our system, I continued with what was already in progress from the previous shift. Work that doesn't pause just because new cases arrive. Previous autopsies still needed to be finalized. Tissue samples collected and properly labeled. Reports filled out with the precise language that courts and insurance companies demand. It's like this, constantly. You alternate between the practical work of cutting into bodies and the bureaucratic necessity of documenting what you find. Without much time to process anything emotionally or philosophically, I returned to the autopsy room several times throughout the evening to retrieve materials and check on various stages of examination. But I didn't approach the man's gurney directly. Didn't give him more than a passing glance. He was there in the corner, covered from head to feet, bodies stretched out in the familiar posture of death like any other that arrives during a shift. He was just another form to fill out, another case number in the endless stream. Around 8 o'clock, having finally completed one examination and filed its preliminary findings, I went to prepare the materials to begin his autopsy, to give him the attention and documentation he was legally entitled to receive. I pulled on fresh gloves, adjusted my mask, slipped into a clean lab coat, and entered the room with my mind already running through the procedure I'd performed hundreds of times before. In the middle of that familiar silence, broken only by the hum of ventilation and the distant sounds of the corridor, I heard something that made every muscle in my body freeze. It was a sound, low and continuous, muffled by the sheet, but unmistakable once you heard it. I stopped by pure instinct, by something primal that recognizes wrongness before the conscious mind can name it. It was a sound I knew intimately from years of this work, but one I absolutely did not expect to hear in this room, from a body that had been declared dead more than 2 hours ago. In that first second of confusion, my rational mind tried to explain it away as something mechanical, perhaps compressed air leaking from equipment or some machine left running by mistake. I looked around the room carefully, scanning for the source. No compressor was running, no aspirator was switched on, just the gurneys and the distant ambient noise from the hallway beyond. The sound was coming from the direction of the gurney where the man lay, and as I focused on it, I realized it was like a shallow breath, repetitive and rhythmic. Those of us who work with bodies learn early that gases escape from the dead, especially in the first hours after death, the body releasing what it no longer needs to contain. But this wasn't a single random escape or the occasional hiss of decomposition beginning its work. This was rhythmic, weak, but constant, following a pattern that biological reflex creates. I approached slowly, my heart beginning to pound in a way it rarely does anymore in this room. I placed my hand over the sheet at chest height and felt something that should not have been possible. There was movement beneath my palm, minimal and almost imperceptible, but undeniably there, rising, falling in the the eternal rhythm that defines the difference between being alive and being dead. I pulled back the sheet slowly, revealing him inch by inch until his chest was exposed. His face was pale, almost gray, lips showing the bluish tinge of poor circulation, jaw relaxed in the slackness that comes with unconsciousness or death. There was no sign of awareness, no flicker of consciousness behind those closed eyelids, but his chest was moving, barely but definitively. It rose and fell in small increments, slow and labored but synchronized with some deep mechanism that refused to quit.
This wasn't a spasm or involuntary twitch, wasn't the passive release of trapped air. This was respiratory effort, the body fighting to continue existing even when everything else had shut down. I grabbed the stethoscope from the instrument tray with hands that were suddenly less steady than they should have been. I placed it on his chest, moving it to locate his heart first. Silence, absolute and complete. No lub-dub of valves opening and closing. No sound of chambers contracting to push blood through dying vessels. Then I moved to his lungs, pressing the cold metal against his ribs. There was air moving, very little and profoundly irregular, but it was there, forcing itself in and struggling back out. My brain scrambled desperately to find a logical explanation that would make this fit into the framework of medical knowledge ID built over years. Agonal respiration, perhaps, the final residual activity of a brainstem that doesn't know it's supposed to be dead yet. Neurons firing their last signals into flesh that can no longer respond. But this was happening more than 2 hours after the official declaration of death, after a doctor at the hospital had listened and heard nothing had. Checked for pulse and found none had written the time and signed their name. I stepped out of the room without a word, moving faster than dignity would normally permit, and went to find the most experienced medical examiner on shift, someone who'd seen more death than I had, who might be able to tell me I wasn't losing my grip on reality. He entered the room behind me, his face showing the weariness of too many shifts, and walked directly to the gurney without hesitation. He lifted the sheet back to expose the chest, observed in silence for several long seconds that felt like hours, then picked up my stethoscope and conducted his own examination. He checked for heartbeat, found the same nothing I had found. Checked the pupils with a pen light, noted their lack of response. Then he set the stethoscope down on the metal tray with a sound that seemed too loud to final, and spoke words that would echo in my mind for years. Jesus Christ, this man died here, right here in our facility. He wasn't dead when he arrived, when they loaded him into that transport van and drove him across the city. Nobody said anything more for several seconds that stretched into an uncomfortable eternity. The air in the room felt heavier somehow, pressing down on all of us with the weight of what we'd just discovered. He noted the actual time of death right there, writing it into the margins of the intake form with firm strokes of his pen. Afterward, we went back through the hospital's documentation with new eyes, searching for what had been missed or overlooked. There was no record of continuous ECG monitoring, no detailed information about total duration of resuscitation maneuvers, just the stark notation. CPR without response, death declared. At a hospital with chronic overload and critically ill patients arriving faster than they can be properly assessed. These things happen with a frequency that should horrify us all, but protocol demands more than what was given to this man. Requires more thorough verification before writing someone off as dead. Auscultation for at least a full minute without interruption. Continuous monitoring for 5 minutes to ensure no return of cardiac activity, to physicians to confirm in certain cases where death might be ambiguous. None of that documentation was present in his file. None of those safeguards had been followed or recorded. There in the coroner's office, with him lying on our table already, there was nothing more we could do except bear witness to his final moments. That weak respiration was the last reflex of a body that refused to understand it was finished. A few minutes later, less than 10, it ceased completely, the chest finally going still under our watching eyes. But the undeniable fact remained a truth we'd have to document and report. When he had entered the removal vehicle at the hospital, when they'd zipped him into that body bag and logged him as deceased, he still had vital activity, his brainstem still sending desperate signals to lungs that tried to obey. The body was prepared for autopsy normally after that, following all the usual procedures. The official record noted respiratory failure as the ultimate cause, the final system to surrender in a cascade of failures. But we all knew what the unofficial truth was, the story we'd tell each other in quiet moments. He'd died here, died on our gurney, while waiting for an examination that came too late to matter, died alone under a white sheet, while we worked on other cases just feet away, never knowing he was still fighting to stay alive. There was no formal inquiry, no official investigation launched to examine what had happened. No committee convened to ask uncomfortable questions about protocols and failures. The case was filed away like any other, reduced to paperwork and case numbers, absorbed into the system that processes thousands of deaths without pausing to consider each individual tragedy. I continued my shift that night, moving through the remaining hours with mechanical precision, but that image stayed lodged in my head like a splinter I couldn't remove. The low sound, continuous and impossibly present, the minimal movement beneath the sheet that shouldn't have been there, and the terrible certainty that in that moment he still wasn't a cadaver, still possessed that indefinable quality we call life, even as it slipped away from him. I finished my rotation shortly after 7 in the morning, the sun rising over a city that had no idea what had transpired in our basement facility. I handed over all the reports with their neat conclusions, signed my name where required, provided the briefing for the incoming shift about pending cases and unfinished business. Nobody mentioned that case again, not in the hallways or the break room, not in the quiet moments when medical examiners sometimes share the stories that haunt them. Not even me, though I thought about it constantly. But since that Friday night, since watching a man die who was supposed to already be dead, every intake form that arrives gets my personal verification, my own eyes and hands confirming what the paperwork claims. Because on that particular evening, someone was declared deceased before their time had actually come. And they died staring up at the white ceiling of the morgue alone, except for the bodies surrounding them that could offer no comfort or witness. I remember his face as if it were yesterday, not because he was someone I knew personally, someone whose name would mean anything to me outside these walls, but because I spent more than half an hour looking at him, studying every detail with the attention that our protocols demand. And when you spend that much time with a body, moving through each stage of the procedure with careful deliberation, documenting and preparing and treating the dead with whatever dignity this profession allows, there's no way to forget what you've seen. He was a man of 49 years, a long-term patient at the hospital whose chart I'd glimpsed before, whose case ID followed peripherally while he was still among the living and fighting whatever illness had brought him there. I had accompanied some aspects of his treatment while he remained in the ward, watching from a professional distance as his condition deteriorated. But the actual death certification was handled by a different shift, other hands signing off on the moment his heart stopped. When I received the call to come prepare him, I was already in the necropsy sector, already in the mindset required for this kind of work. The first step, as it always is, was proper identification, the careful verification that prevents the nightmare scenario of sending the wrong body to the wrong family. I checked the bracelet on his wrist, reading the name carefully, noting the complete spelling. Birth date that would now also mark the span of his life, patient record number that tied him 2 years of medical documentation. I compared it letter by letter with the intake form that accompanied him, ensuring everything matched exactly, no discrepancies that might
indicate confusion or error in the chaos of a busy hospital. The body rested on the transport gurney, covered by a standard white sheet that turned him into just another anonymous shape waiting for processing. When I pulled back the covering, revealing him to the fluorescent lights, I saw that his face was slightly swollen, particularly in the region around his eyes and cheeks where fluid had accumulated. Edema from a prolonged hospitalization. Nothing outside the common patterns I'd observed countless times before in patients who'd spent weeks or months confined to beds. His beard needed shaving, several days of growth, giving his jaw a rough appearance, and his hair was somewhat oily, bearing the unmistakable signs of someone too ill to maintain the grooming habits that define us in healthier times. I had seen that appearance many times before in my career, and no, it's never pleasant to witness how illness strips away the superficial markers of dignity and self. But it's part of what we do here, part of bearing witness to the end of human life in all its unglamorous reality. I proceeded to the photographic documentation, a mandatory step that must be completed before the body can be sealed in its bag. I photographed his face from the front, capturing his features in the harsh lighting that hides nothing, then moved to profile shots from the right and left sides, and finally took a full body image that would become part of his permanent record. All photos included the identification tag visible in the corner of the frame, ensuring there could be no confusion later about which body these images documented. Afterward, I performed the standard post-mortem care procedures, the small acts of respect we offer to those who can no longer care for themselves. Quick hygiene, repositioning of the arms into a more natural pose, gentle closure of eyelids that would never open again. When was the last time you truly looked at something, really saw it with the kind of attention that burns details into memory, that makes forgetting impossible, ... Do you think we're capable of trusting our own perceptions? Or do we only see what we expect to see? What fits the narrative we've already constructed about how reality should work? I checked to ensure there were no personal belongings left on the body, no wedding ring or wallet or photograph that would need to be cataloged and returned to family, but there was nothing, just the hospital gown and the flesh beneath it. Next, I placed him into the white cadaver bag, working the zipper slowly from bottom to top until he was completely enclosed. I attached the identification tag to the handle with the case number written in permanent marker, reinforcing it so there could be no possibility of it falling off or becoming I noted in the sector's physical logbook the exact time of closure and added my signature, creating the paper trail that documents every step of our process. The sound of that zipper closing always produces a strange sensation in me, even after all these years, like I'm sealing away not just a body but a whole life, all the experiences and relationships and dreams that once animated this flesh. It's like placing a period at the end of a sentence, a final punctuation that cannot be undone. But on that day, there was nothing different about the procedure. Nothing that would have suggested what was coming. What impossible thing would confront me just days later? Leave in the comments a declaration beginning with "I accept that ... about something in your existence that challenges your understanding of reality. Some experience or observation that doesn't fit neatly into the frameworks you use to make sense of the world." These acknowledgments of mystery and uncertainty create space for others to admit their own confusion, to stop pretending they have everything figured out. Your acceptance might free someone else from the exhausting burden of needing to explain every anomaly, every strange occurrence that defies rational explanation. I wheeled the gurney to the cold chamber, the wheels squeaking slightly on the tile floor, and verified the drawer number assigned to his body in our tracking system. I fitted him into the space, sliding the gurney platform into the refrigerated compartment, with movements practiced over hundreds of similar transfers, and registered everything in our internal database. The compressor for the chamber was running louder than normal that day, producing a constant rumble that you could feel vibrating through the floor beneath your feet. A reminder of the mechanical systems that keep decomposition at bay. Work completed, everything executed according to standard procedures. No failures or deviations that would require additional documentation or explanation. 3 days later, I returned to the morgue because authorization for release to the family had finally been processed through whatever bureaucratic channels these things must travel. The routine for release is straightforward and simple. Performed so many times it becomes almost automatic. Open the assigned drawer, verify the identification tag Machias, the paperwork check that the body is in appropriate condition for viewing, and transport complete the final registration in our systems and transfer custody to the funeral home agent, who will handle the next stage of this person's journey from life to burial. I was already operating in that automatic mode, my mind half focused on the mundane steps of the procedure, when the zipper was pulled open and I froze completely, every muscle locking as my brain tried to process what my eyes were reporting. The face looking up at me from inside that bag was not the same face I had prepared 3 days earlier. Not the features I had photographed and cleaned and studied with such care. I stood there staring for several long seconds, my thoughts racing to find some quick explanation that would make this make sense. Some rational cause that would restore order to a suddenly chaotic situation. The tag on the bag's handle was identical to the one I had personally filled out, my own handwriting staring back at me in permanent marker. The drawer number was correct, pulled from exactly where our records indicated he should be. The intake form clipped to the clipboard showed no alterations or corrections, no signs that anyone had tampered with documentation. But the face was wrong in ways I couldn't immediately articulate but felt with absolute certainty. The first detail that caught my attention was that it appeared thinner somehow. The swelling I'd observed 3 days ago had vanished completely. Up to that point, I could rationalize it as normal, because edema can regress in the days following death, as fluids redistribute and settle. But it wasn't only the swelling that had changed. It wasn't just a matter of fluid dynamics and post-mortem processes. The shape of the chin seemed different, more pronounced or perhaps more recessed. I couldn't quite pin down the alteration, but I could see it. The nose appeared slightly more refined, narrower at the bridge in a way I didn't remember from my initial examination. The hair that had been dark brown, almost black in the overhead lights, was now visibly lighter showing, as a medium brown shade that pulled toward blonde at the tips as if it had been growing out from a dye job. And there was something impossible to ignore, something that made my professional certainty crumble into doubt. A horizontal scar, discreet but absolutely clear, at the base of his neck. I had cleaned that body 3 days ago, washed it from the neck down to the feet with my own hands as part of standard preparation, and there'd be no scar in that location. Nothing that would have caught my attention or required documentation. If it had been there, if any mark that obvious had existed on his skin, I would have seen it, would have noted it in my report, and probably photographed it as part of the comprehensive record we maintain. My first reaction was to request access to the photos from the initial intake, the documentation that should confirm my memory, or reveal my error. I opened our computer system, pulled up his file with trembling fingers, and enlarged the images on the screen, studying them with an intensity that made my eyes hurt. This wasn't a matter of faulty memory or subjective impression distorted by time. The skin of his neck in those photographs was completely clean, unmarked by any scar tissue or previous injury. The beard growth was the same length I remembered several days of stubble that matched what I was seeing now. But the skin tone was noticeably different, the overall complexion showing variations that couldn't be explained by lighting or camera settings. I called over the technician who was working with me in the room, needing another set of eyes to confirm or deny what seemed increasingly impossible. He looked at the body, then compared it with the image on the screen, his brow furrowing slightly as he processed what he was seeing. "Face seems the same," he finally said with a shrug that suggested he didn't want to get involved in whatever complication I was creating. "Just more weight loss? More emaciated? Bodies change after a few days. You know that," I insisted, pointing directly at the scar that I could not have missed during initial preparation, making him look at the specific detail that troubled me most. He gave another shrug, even more dismissive this time, his tone suggesting I was making something out of nothing. Could be a mark that appeared later. Who knows? Maybe some discoloration that became more visible with time. These things happen with decomposition. But that wasn't discoloration or some artifact of post-mortem change. That was scar tissue, healed and old. The kind of mark that takes months or years to form, not days in a refrigerated drawer. Still, I followed protocol because that's what we do when faced with the inexplicable. We cling to procedure like a lifeline. I requested a double verification with another professional, bringing in a second opinion to either validate my concerns or dismiss them as the product of an overactive imagination. I called the chief of pathology, a man with decades of experience who'd seen everything our profession could offer. He came into the room, examined the body with what seemed like deliberate speed, and spoke with a confidence that allowed no room for doubt or discussion. It is the same body, no question about it. The edema reduced significantly. The pallor increased as cellular processes continued. These changes can dramatically alter physiognomy in ways that surprise people who aren't used to observing them. The scar probably just went unnoticed before, easy to miss in certain lighting or if you weren't specifically looking for it. I responded that it couldn't have been missed, that I personally had washed that neck with my own hands and would have absolutely noticed such an obvious mark. He simply repeated his assessment that everything was in accordance with protocol, that there were no inconsistencies in our records or documentation, that I was seeing changes where there were only the normal progressions of death. I turned back to look at the face again, studying it with an attention that bordered on obsession, searching for something that would definitively prove or disprove what I was feeling. It wasn't just the physical differences that disturbed me. It was under merely the alterations in features or coloring that could perhaps be explained by postmortem processes I didn't fully understand. It was the sensation, impossible to quantify or document, but absolutely real to me, of standing before a different person entirely. Someone similar enough to fool photographs and intake forms and computer systems. Someone who could pass all our verification protocols and still be wrong. But not similar enough to fool someone who had looked into those closed eyes twice, who had touched that skin and memorized those features with the attention we reserve for the dead who depend on us to treat them with dignity. On the day of release, the funeral home agent was already waiting in the morgue's reception area. His presence a reminder that the world outside our walls was impatient for closure, for bodies to be returned to families so that grief could properly begin. He signed all the required documentation without reading it, carefully checked the identification tag with a glance that suggested this was routine for him, and accompanied me to the cold chamber to collect what he assumed was the correct body. I still harbored a hope, however absurd it might have been given everything I'd already verified, of opening that drawer and finding the face I had prepared 3 days earlier. The features that matched my photographs and my memory, but when I pulled the drawer open, exposing the body bag to the warmer air of the corridor, it was the same altered face I'd seen the previous day. Thinner, lighter hair, that impossible scar marking the base of the neck like an accusation. The agent looked quickly, confirmed the tag matched his paperwork, and stepped away to retrieve the transport gurney, already moving on mentally to his next pickup or delivery. While he walked down the hall, I stood there alone with the body lying exposed on the extended drawer. The bag unzipped to reveal that face that both was and wasn't the man I prepared. The sensation washing over me was of participating in a mistaken delivery, sending the wrong person to the wrong family. But with all the papers properly signed and stamped, with every system we have in place confirming that everything was correct and proper, I closed the zipper slowly, listening to the metallic sound of the teeth interlocking, and it seemed longer than usual, more drawn out, as if the universe was giving me one last chance to stop this transfer and demand answers to questions I could improperly formulate. I completed the final registration in our computer system, noting the exact time of release, and signed the authorization that would allow him to leave our custody forever. The agent wheeled the body down the corridor toward the exit, the gurney's wheels producing their familiar squeak against the floor. I followed a few steps behind, watching that white bag move further away from me with each moment, carrying its mystery toward burial and the end of any possibility of resolution. He passed through the door and the gurney disappeared from my sight, leaving me standing in an empty hallway with more questions than I'd had when the shift began. I returned to the office area, sat down heavily in the chair before the computer, and stared at the screen where all our verifications were displayed in neat digital columns. Every confirmation we require was documented there, every protocol properly followed and signed off, creating a perfect paper trail that said nothing unusual had occurred, that this was just another routine release of just another deceased patient. All the checks and balances were present and accounted for, every box ticked, every signature in its proper place, forming an impenetrable wall of documentation that left no room for doubt or questions about what had actually transpired in our cold chambers during those 3 days between preparation and release. Tagata drawer number verified, initial photographs filed, signature from the chief of pathology confirming everything on paper is absolutely perfect. All boxes checked and protocols satisfied, but I knew what I had seen with my own eyes. I knew what my hands had touched and measured and documented. I had prepared that man with careful attention to every detail, treated him with the dignity our profession demands. And what left our facility that day in that white bag was not him, was not the person I had photographed and cleaned and committed to memory. I had already seen everything imaginable during these years working in the morgue encountered, every variety of death and decay that flesh can undergo. But there's one specific night that returns to my mind even today, replaying itself with the clarity of recent memory as if it had happened just yesterday instead of years ago. It was during an overnight shift at the public hospital, here in the interior of Serra, a small facility far from the capital where resources are always stretched thin and procedures sometimes bend under the weight of necessity. The hospital itself is modest, equipped with a refrigerated chamber housing just 6 drawers, connected by a short corridor that always feels too cold no matter what season brings heat to the world outside these walls. It was around 3 in the morning when the SAMU emergency team arrived, their ambulance pulling up to the loading area with its lights painting the darkness red and white. They brought a male body with no identification documents, no one accompanying him to claim relationship or responsibility, no family member standing vigil over his final journey. On the intake form, the cause was listed simply as death in public thoroughfare. Cause undetermined. Nothing more specific than those bare facts. Just those words and nothing else. No additional details that might tell his story or explain how he came to die alone on some street corner. They hadn't even noted his exact age, just provided an estimate based on appearance. Another erasure of identity in a system overwhelmed by nameless deaths. I performed the standard procedure we follow for unidentified remains, checked thoroughly to see if there were any belongings in his pockets, or hidden in his clothing that might provide a name or address. Nothing at all. Not a wallet, or phone, or scrap of paper with someone's number. I registered him in the entrance logbook, noted the time with precision, attached the identification tag bearing only a case number, and the words unidentified to the clipboard that hangs on the chamber door. I positioned his body carefully in drawer, for checking that everything was properly aligned, then closed it and engaged the latch, with the automatic movements of someone who has performed this action thousands of times. It's become so routine after all these years that my hands know the sequence without conscious thought, muscle memory guiding me through each step. I always confirm that the lock is secure before leaving, testing it with a firm push to ensure nothing can shift or open unexpectedly during the hours ahead. The chamber at that early morning hour was almost empty, offering a rare abundance of space in a facility usually packed beyond capacity. Only drawer 2 was occupied, holding the body of an elderly woman who had been brought in late that afternoon, already identified by her family, who had wept in the hallway outside. The rest stood vacant, waiting for the next arrivals that would inevitably come. The lighting inside the chamber is always the same, cold and fluorescent, designed to eliminate every corner of shadow where uncertainty might hide. The constant noise of the compressor provides a steady hum that becomes almost comforting in its predictability, and there's that particular smell that permeates everything. Not quite the scent of death, exactly. It's more of the frozen air mixed with cheap disinfectant, a chemical coldness that strips away the organic reality of what we store here. Do you ever wonder what happens in the spaces we do on at watch, and the hours when we turn our backs and assume everything stays exactly as we left it? ... What would it mean if the world we think is solid and predictable was actually fluid and strange, rearranging itself in the darkness when no one is looking ... After I stored the body and verified everything was secure, I closed the chamber door firmly and returned to my office located in the same corridor just a few yards away. I settled in to finish some registration paperwork from the previous shift. The endless documentation that seems to multiply faster than we can process it. Overnight shifts follow a particular rhythm, quiet and slow, where you spend far more time with forms and files than actually handling both. Nothing else was happening in the facility. The hospital above us sleeping in that strange suspended state that healthcare facilities achieve in the small hours. It remained that way until around 5:30 in the morning, that transitional time when night begins surrendering to dawn. Express in the comments the commitment beginning with a decide ... double quotes. About how you choose to face the inexplicable moments in your life, the things that challenge your understanding of how reality works. These declarations of decision, these statements of how we choose to respond when faced with mystery, create a roadmap for others who are paralyzed by uncertainty. Your decision to engage with the unknown rather than deny it might inspire someone else to stop running from the questions that haunt them, to turn and face whatever strange truth is pursuing them through the darkness. I stood up to retrieve an old intake form from the filing cabinet and decided while I was up to enter the chamber and conduct a general inspection. Just routine maintenance to ensure everything was functioning correctly. That's when I saw it, when my entire understanding of what was possible shifted in an instant. Drawer 4 was empty, standing open with nothing inside its cold metal cavity. I froze there with my hands still on the handle, staring at the vacant space that should have contained the man ID secured just a few hours earlier. I looked again, checked the tag on the door to make sure I had the right drawer number. Nothing. No mistake on my part. The drawer gaped open and empty, cold air spilling out, but without any body to justify its refrigeration. And then, in that same second of confused realization, my gaze shifted to drawer 2, and I felt something cold that had nothing to do with temperature crawl up my spine. Drawer 2 was too full somehow, packed in a way that shouldn't have been possible, given the dimensions we work with. I pulled it out slowly, just a few inches, dreading what I would find but needing to see. The elderly woman's body was still there in its expected position, but pressed tight behind her, forced into a space far too small, was the unidentified man I had placed in drawer 4. I stood motionless for several long seconds, my brain refusing to process or accept what my eyes were clearly showing me. Morgue drawers aren't wide or spacious, barely accommodate a single body lying flat with any dignity. What I was seeing was physically forced, unnatural. 2 bodies, crammed side by side with knees bent at awkward angles, arms compressed against torsos, everything squeezed together in a configuration that spoke of effort and intention. To accomplish this arrangement, someone would have needed to open drawer to completely slide the woman's body to one side position, the man's body beside her, and close everything back up with enough force to overcome the resistance of too much mass and too little space. The first thought that came to me, the rational explanation my mind reached for desperately, was that I had made an error, that perhaps I'd placed him in the wrong drawer from the beginning and my memory was playing tricks. But that explanation dissolved under examination because it made no logical sense at all. I remembered perfectly the sensation of opening drawer, for feeling the resistance of an empty drawer sliding on its tracks, pushing the platform all the way to the back before positioning his body. Beyond that, his identification tag was still fixed to the clipboard as drawer 4, exactly where I had placed it when documenting his storage. The chamber isn't a space where people circulate freely. isn't accessible to anyone who happens to wander past. Only I possessed the key during that overnight shift. Only I had authorization to enter or remove anything. The chamber door remains in my direct line of sight when I'm sitting at my desk working. Impossible for anyone to enter without me noticing. And the internal cameras that record continuously 24 hours a day cover both the entrance and the interior, capturing every movement and action for the security logs we maintain. I went directly to the computer to pull up the recorded footage from the previous hours, searching for whatever I had somehow missed or failed to notice. Nothing at all. No evidence of any activity. Nobody had entered the chamber after me. No drawers had been opened by unseen hands. Only my own figure appeared on the screen at 3 in the morning, storing the body exactly as I remembered doing. After that, nothing but silence and stillness. The empty corridor and the closed chamber door remaining undisturbed through all the hours that followed. I returned to the chamber to examine everything again with fresh eyes, hoping to find some detail that would explain the impossible. That's when I noticed something I had missed in my initial shock. The door wasn't closed the way I had left it secured. The latch hadn't been turned all the way to its locked position, was merely resting in place, without actually engaging the mechanism that would hold it fast. And the tag bearing the words unidentified and the drawer number had vanished from the clipboard where I had attached it, leaving only the metal clip empty and accusing. The corridor remained exactly as it always was at this hour, flooded with cold fluorescent light, the air motionless and heavy, that low mechanical hum of refrigeration units providing the only sound. There was no sign of forced entry or tampering, nothing displaced or disturbed that might indicate an intruder had been here. But drawer 4 stood open and empty as an accusation, while drawer 2 continued holding both bodies pressed together in that impossible configuration that shouldn't exist. In that moment, standing alone in that cold corridor with more questions than answers. The most logical course of action was to contact my supervisor and report what I had discovered. And that's exactly what I did, reaching for the phone with hands that trembled slightly despite my attempts at professional composure. I called the duty supervisor, explained everything I had found in careful detail, described the empty drawer and the doubled occupancy and the missing tag. He listened to my entire account in complete silence, not interrupting with questions or expressions of disbelief, just absorbing the information I was providing. When I finished speaking, his response came with a flatness that somehow made everything worse. Fix it and follow protocol. Aside simply, then the line went dead. I set the phone down and stood there frozen, his words hammering in my head with the weight of what they implied. Fix it and follow protocol. As if what I had discovered was merely an administrative inconvenience, rather than an impossibility that defied every law of physics and security I understood. I opened drawer 2 completely, working with exaggerated care as if sudden movements might disturb more than just the bodies. As if I could somehow avoid acknowledging what I was doing, I removed the man's body first, lifting him out of that cramped position where he shouldn't have been. I repositioned the woman exactly as she had been before, restoring her to solitary dignity. Then I carried him back to drawer for where he belonged according to my records, placed him inside with the gentleness our profession demands, and closed the drawer firmly. I engaged the latch properly this time, testing it multiple times to ensure it was truly locked. I attached a new identification tag to the clipboard, as if it were the original that had somehow fallen and been lost. In the registration logbook, I adjusted the time notation and drawer number, making everything conform to what my supervisor had instructed, erasing the anomaly from official existence. Officially, according to every document and record we maintain, nothing had ever been out of place. Nothing irregular or unexplained had occurred during my overnight shift. There was no investigation launched to examine security footage more carefully. No cold place to bring in additional personnel to verify the chamber's integrity. No meeting convened to discuss incorrect procedures or potential breaches. The man's body remained stored in drawer for 42 more days without incident, until finally being released for burial as without documentation or family or even a name to mark his passing from this world. I continued working my shifts as if nothing unusual had happened, maintaining the professional detachment that keeps us sane in this line of work. But every single time I needed to open the chamber after that night, my eyes went directly to drawer 4 before I could stop them, checking to see if anything had changed or moved again. And even without intending to, without conscious decision, I found myself testing the latch 2 or 3 times before leaving, making absolutely certain it was engaged and locked. Nothing similar ever happened again in all the months and years that followed. No more bodies migrating between drawers, or tags disappearing from clipboards. And perhaps that's exactly why it disturbs me so profoundly. Why I go and simply file it away and forget, like I do with most strange occurrences in this profession. It wasn't a pattern we could analyze, or a recurring error we could correct through better procedures. It was just that one time, that single unexplained event that stands alone in my memory, like a warning or a message I never fully decoded. I never worked with Drawer 4 after that incident. Avoided assigning it whenever possible, even though that meant using more distant drawers that required extra walking. It might seem like paranoia or superstition, irrational thinking from someone whose profession demands cold rationality. But there are things you learn to respect in the silence of places like this. Truths that don't fit in official reports or training manuals. And there in that chamber on that particular night, something showed me with unmistakable clarity that the dead don't always stay where we put them. That the boundaries we draw between possible and impossible are thinner than we want to believe. I work in the morgue at the urgent care facility. Here in the interior, I've been doing this job for 11 years now, without break or transfer. It is not one of those large hospital morgues you see in the city with their extensive facilities and multiple staff members. This is a small annex, with just 3 cold chambers in space for a little more than 10 drawers total. A cramped facility that serves our rural community. I handle the cleaning, organization, verification of identification tags. Nothing that would impress anyone or make for interesting conversation. But it is work that demands careful attention to detail and respect for the dead who pass through our care. Here you learn early in your tenure that you can't afford to rush through. Procedures can't create problems by reacting emotionally to what you see, and believe me, you see absolutely everything that death can do to a human body. In the beginning of my time here, I confess I tried to remember the names of everyone who came through. Attempted to hold on to their identities and stories. Today, I don't bother anymore. I've learned that particular form of self-protection. Here inside these walls, we work by case numbers, not by names that carry the weight of vanished lives. You enter, verify the tag matches, the paperwork, check that everything is properly sealed and secured, clean the exterior surfaces, and that's it. Process complete. It's the same routine with everyone, whether it is someone with family members waiting anxiously in the reception area, or a body that no one has come to claim. That'll go to an unmarked grave with nothing but a number to distinguish it from all the others. It was on a Monday morning, the beginning of a new week, when he arrived in our facility. Male, appearing to be in his early 50s, based on visual assessment, with no identification documents and no one accompanying him to provide information. They had brought him from the street where he'd been found. Told us he had experienced some kind of medical episode and had even survived long enough to reach emergency care. The intake staff registered him as indigent, following our standard protocols, assigned a case number to the paperwork, and called me to transport him to the chamber for storage. I noticed he was still wearing his simple everyday clothing, light-colored pants and a button-up shirt that had seen better days, but was basically clean. He looked like someone who had been going to work, or perhaps returning home, living an ordinary day that became his last. But those details don't change anything about our procedures. Don't make the process any different. Tag, intake form, drawer assignment. The same steps we follow regardless of who the person was or how they died. The coffin provided for indigent burials is always identical. Made of thin wood with a simple lid. Nothing decorative or finished. Just functional containment. We placed him inside according to protocol, and that was that. Another case number in our logbooks. The system showed that the municipal funeral service would collect him the following day for burial in the public cemetery where the unclaimed are laid to rest. Except the following day, nothing happened. No funeral service arrived to collect him. I entered the chamber to perform my cleaning routine, checked the temperature gauges to ensure proper refrigeration, inspected all the drawers for any problems. Everything appeared correct and normal. His drawers showed the same sealed condition, intake form hanging in its proper place. No signs of malfunction or concern. I thought to myself that it must be a delay in their schedule, that they would surely come tomorrow to complete the pickup. On the third day, I stopped by the coordination office during my break and inquired about the status of the unclaimed body. The woman from social services said that the funeral company hadn't received the notification form, that she would resend it immediately. Here in our small facility, this happens with unfortunate frequency. Paperwork that disappears into bureaucratic voids. Messages that never arrive at their intended destinations. I didn't give it much importance at the time. Just made a note in my personal logbook. Day 3. Still in drawer 7. Awaiting collection. On the 5th day, I began noticing something unusual that I couldn't easily explain away. His drawer had small droplets of water running down the outside surface. Just his drawer and none of the others. It wasn't a lot of moisture, not a flood or even a steady drip, but enough to be visible, marking the metal with thin trails that caught the light. My first thought was condensation, a common enough occurrence when temperature differentials create moisture in the air. This happens sometimes when the chamber door gets opened too frequently, allowing warm air to enter and creating conditions for water to form on cold surfaces. But I knew I hadn't been opening it that often. Hadn't deviated from my normal routine of entering twice per shift for cleaning and inspection. I wiped the moisture away with a cloth, closed everything securely, and continued with the rest of my day's responsibilities. The smell during this period remained normal for our facility. Nothing that raised any concerns or suggested something wrong. Anyone who works with cold chambers knows there's always a particular background odor in the air, something you can't quite eliminate no matter how much cleaning solution you use. It's not strong or offensive, not the rot of decomposition when refrigeration fails. It's more like the smell of the machinery itself, mixed with industrial cleaning products. A chemical coldness that becomes so familiar you stop noticing it. And it was like that. Nothing outside the usual parameters we expect. On the 7th day, I returned to find those droplets present again in exactly the same location. Same drawer. Same pattern of moisture tracking down the metal surface. This time I spent longer examining it, standing there in the cold air trying to understand what I was seeing. I wiped down the moisture with my cleaning cloth, went to store the bucket in its proper place, and stood for a moment in the doorway of the chamber just listening to the sound of the motor running. It's a continuous noise, deep and steady like the fan in a large commercial refrigerator. The kind of sound that becomes background static after you've worked here long enough. But in the middle of that familiar hum, for maybe 2 seconds at most, I heard a creaking sound, very low and subtle, like wood adjusting to pressure or temperature change. It could have been the coffin settling as materials contract and expand in the cold. Could have been any number of innocent explanations. Here inside these walls, strange sounds are nothing new. Nothing to necessarily worry about. The building itself makes noises constantly. Metal expanding, pipes settling, machinery cycling through its programmed routines. But still, I glanced at my watch and made another notation in my personal log. Day 7. Water and creaking sound observed. By this point in the process, nobody in the administrative area was talking about him anymore. Had moved on to more pressing concerns that demanded immediate attention. When I inquired at the reception desk about whether they'd resolved the pickup situation, the response was dismissive and brief, still pending in the system, spoken with the weariness of someone who deals with too many pending items. For me, that meant he would continue occupying drawer 7 indefinitely, and I would continue passing by that particular drawer multiple times, every single day during my shifts, unable to ignore its presence or the subtle wrongness that seemed to emanate from it. On the 8th day, when I entered to perform my routine cleaning, the first thing I did was run my hand along the drawer fronts to check for moisture accumulation. I went directly to his drawer, number 7. Already knowing what I would find, but hoping somehow to be wrong. It was damp again in that same minimal way. Just those fine droplets that gather in corners and trickle down slowly, marking the metal with their passage. The chamber was maintaining the correct temperature according to all our instruments. The motor running in its regulated cycle, everything appearing normal by every measurable standard. I made my notation in the logbook. Day 8. Drawer sweating. Same pattern observed. You learn in this work to pay attention to details that other people overlook or dismiss as irrelevant. Small signs that might indicate larger problems developing. The rubber seal that runs around the door perimeter, for example, preventing warm air from entering the refrigerated space. If that seal becomes warped or misaligned even slightly, it allows outside air to infiltrate and causes condensation to form on cold surfaces. I examined the seal carefully, running my finger along its entire length slowly, searching for gaps or deformities. I saw nothing wrong, nothing that would explain the persistent moisture on just that one drawer. I also inspected the metal track that allows the drawer to slide in and out smoothly. Those precision-engineered rails that bear the weight of bodies and coffins day after day. There was a small mark of standing water there, cooled in a slight depression as if a thin stream had been running and then dried in place. I cleaned it thoroughly with deliberate care, closed everything securely, and went to complete the rest of my daily responsibilities. On the 10th day, I asked again at the reception desk, trying to keep the frustration out of my voice. "What is the status on removal for that indigent in drawer 7? The woman behind the desk was curt in her response, her tone suggesting she was tired of my questions. "Still pending. They're saying the paperwork never arrived at the funeral home." It's not that the people who work here are deliberately negligent or uncaring about their duties. It's that nobody has enough resources or time to handle everything that needs handling. Everyone is stretched beyond capacity. Each person resolves what they can manage to resolve, and everything else remains exactly where it is, stuck in bureaucratic limbo. I understood the reality of our situation and returned to my work area without pressing the issue further. That night, I picked up an extended shift, covering for someone who'd called in sick, which meant I'd be here through the darkest hours, when the facility becomes almost silent. During the early morning hours, when the urgent care center goes quiet between emergencies, you hear everything differently. Notice sounds that get drowned out during busier times. The motor of the cold chambers humming their constant rhythm. The squeaking wheels of gurneys being pushed down corridors. A door slamming somewhere in the distance. All these noises become amplified in the stillness. I entered the chamber to restock cleaning supplies and found myself standing motionless inside, just listening to the soundscape around me. The motor produces that continuous drone, but occasionally it makes a sharp crack as if metal. Components are expanding and contracting with temperature fluctuations, finding new positions in response to physical forces. Have you ever felt the weight of something unseen, some presence that can't be measured or photographed but presses against your consciousness with undeniable reality? What do you do when the world insists everything is normal while your instincts scream that something is profoundly wrong, that the ordinary explanations don't account for what you're experiencing? It was during that quiet moment of attention that I heard the wooden creaking again, soft and brief, like someone pushing furniture across a floor and then stopping abruptly. I stood there looking at the temperature control panel with its digital readouts, then scanning across the row of drawer fronts. Not rushing, just breathing deeply and trying to assess what I was hearing with rational detachment. Could be the coffin adjusting to cold storage conditions. Could be the metal track beneath it settling under weight. Could be any number of mundane things finding equilibrium. Nothing particularly concerning on its surface. Still, I made my notation with the precision that had become habitual. Day 10. Brief, creaking sound. Same drawer. 12:15 a.m. Share in the comments, beginning with I illuminate ... double quotes. Something about how you bring light to the dark places in your own experience. How you choose to see clearly even when clarity is uncomfortable. These declarations of illumination, these commitments to bearing witness honestly, create permission for others to stop looking away from the things that frighten them. Your willingness to shine light into shadows might give someone else the courage to examine what they've been avoiding, to stop pretending that ignoring something makes it disappear. On day 12, I did something that always helps me maintain objectivity and certainty about my observations. I discreetly marked with a pen a tiny dot on the side of the drawer, right next to the number 7, a reference point that only I would recognize or understand the significance of. When condensation forms, this kind of ink mark sometimes smudges or runs, providing clear evidence of moisture presence. On this drawer, that dot softens slightly around the edges, showing clear water exposure. On the other drawers where I'd made similar marks as controls, the ink remained sharp and unchanged. I wiped away the moisture, dried the surface completely, made the mark again with fresh ink, and closed everything with careful gentleness, avoiding any impact that might jar whatever was happening inside. The smell still wasn't decomposition in the way I'd learned to recognize it. That unmistakable odor of flesh breaking down that no amount of ventilation can completely eliminate. It remained that cold chamber smell, disinfectant, mixed with industrial cleaning products, and the particular scent of refrigerated air, except it was changing somehow in ways I struggled to articulate even to myself. I don't know how to explain it properly. Don't have the vocabulary for what my senses were reporting. It was like the air had become heavier somehow, not foul or overpowering, just weighted with something invisible. I exited the chamber, washed my hands thoroughly at the sink, drank some water to clear my palate, and returned to the main cleaning supply room. I spent time paging through my logbook, reviewing the notations from previous days. looking for patterns or progressions I might have missed. If the funeral service doesn't come by Friday, this is going to become a conversation, I thought to myself, already anticipating the questions and complications that extended storage creates. On day 13, a nurse who regularly passes through this area stopped at my doorway and asked casually, "Is that guy still in drawer 7? I confirmed that yes, he remained in storage awaiting collection. The nurse shook his head with an expression of resigned frustration and spoke quietly, almost as if the words were escaping without his permission. Nobody came for him. Yeah, I agreed. Nobody at all. He responded with what sounded like genuine concern. Call social services again. Pushed him on this. I told him we'd already made multiple calls, that the situation was supposedly being resolved. He shrugged with the helplessness we all feel when dealing with bureaucratic dysfunction, and walked away to attend to his other responsibilities. That's how it goes here. Brief exchanges. Everyone returns to their own section of responsibility without the luxury of following through on every concern. On day 15, the identification tag was already yellowing around its edges, the paper showing signs of prolonged exposure to moisture. It's just a simple tag, attached with twine, listing the case number, date of arrival, and a notation identifying him as indigent. When paper absorbs humidity over time, it changes color at the borders first, turning from white to cream to yellow. I replaced the damp twine with fresh, dry string to prevent it from breaking and losing the tag entirely. While I was there, I took the opportunity to examine underneath the drawer where the bottom of the coffin rests on the metal platform. The wood, which is thin and cheap in these indigent coffins, appeared darker than it should have been. Nothing unusual on any of the other drawers, only on this one. I made my notation. Day 15, tag yellowing, bottom surface darkening, and I wrote beside it, in parentheses, maybe only moisture accumulation. I always wrote explanations like that, rational alternatives to the implications I didn't want to acknowledge. It may be only moisture, I repeated to myself, like a mantra, refusing to give mental space to possibilities that had no place in a professional environment. I attempted to tighten the screws at the front of the drawer, small bolts that sometimes work loose with repeated opening and closing over months of use. Nothing was loose or rattling. Everything remained properly secured. I touched the side panel and noticed that the metal's painted surface showed 3 new scratches, very fine and shallow, right at the height where the sliding track runs. The kind of marks you'd expect from opening and closing a drawer many times, metal scraping against metal through normal use. But I hadn't opened this particular drawer that many times. Had mostly just cleaned its exterior and made my observations. I ran my finger along the scratches, felt a slight powder of rust forming where paint had been removed, and wiped it clean. On day 16, the social services coordinator appeared early in the morning carrying a folder under her arm, looking harried and overworked as always. "We sent it to the funeral home again," she told me, with the wariness of someone who's made the same statement too many times. "They're verifying their vehicle schedule now." I nodded my acknowledgement, having heard similar promises before without seeing results. Sometimes the vehicle breaks down and needs repairs. Sometimes they're short a driver. Sometimes a required signature is missing from some form that nobody can locate. Meanwhile, the body remains in our custody, and we take care of what we can control. Temperature, maintenance, cleaning protocols, proper identification tags. Everything else becomes a waiting game with no clear timeline. On my way out, before switching off the lights for the night, I pressed my forehead against the cold metal door for just a second, feeling that chill radiating through the surface from the refrigerated space beyond. I did this without thinking, without conscious intention behind the gesture. I think it was my way of reminding myself that inside that chamber everything existed in suspended time, days passing normally in the world outside, while here time moved in millimeters measured in droplets and replacement tags and the slow accumulation of wrongness that nobody wanted to acknowledge. I returned to the corridor accompanied by the sound of gurney wheels squeaking somewhere in the distance, that familiar background noise of our facility. A transport worker passed me in the hallway and offered the casual greeting we all use. "Good night. Take care of yourself," I responded with the same phrase. "Good night. Take care." And each of us continued in our separate directions without further conversation because nobody wants to talk much about whoever occupies drawer 7, about the problems that persist without resolution. I had learned not to force conversations about things people preferred to ignore. Had learned that sometimes silence is the professional response even when questions demand answers. I just wanted them to remove him from that drawer. Not because I was afraid exactly, but out of respect for the process they claim exists. The procedures we're supposedly following. But apparently the process itself sits waiting for someone to remember it exists, for someone with authority to finally act. In my final notation for day 20, I wrote more slowly than usual, taking care with my penmanship as if writing neatly could somehow change the reality I was documenting. Drawer 7. Constant moisture. Tag replaced. Coffin bottom swelling. Temperature normal. Removal still pending. I closed the notebook and tucked it into my work coat pocket, where it made a reassuring weight against my chest. When I exited and extinguished the overhead lights, the chamber was left with only the glow from the control panel. That small rectangle of greenish illumination in the darkness that looked disturbingly like an open eye watching everything. I didn't allow myself to think anything beyond what I always think at the end of shifts. Tomorrow, ILL return and check everything again, because that's what this job requires. Endless verification of conditions that never quite resolve themselves. On day 21, I arrived somewhat earlier than my normal schedule, drawn by concern I couldn't quite name. The facility had that particular silence of early morning, when only cleaning staff and a few reception workers are present, before the daily chaos of emergencies and admissions begins. I entered the chamber to verify temperature readings, following my established routine with mechanical precision. The first thing I noticed was that my cleaning cloth became damp immediately upon first contact with drawer 7's surface. It wasn't dripping wet, wasn't leaving puddles, but it was sufficient moisture to make my hand feel cold even through the protective glove I wore. The identification tag I had replaced just yesterday on day 20 already showed slight softening at one corner. You couldn't exactly call it wet, couldn't point to visible water, but it was definitively different from all the other tags that remained crisp and dry. I opened my logbook and made my notation with a precision that had become habitual. New tag already showing moisture, water accumulation same as previous day. I closed the drawer, wiped down the surface again, and stepped into the corridor where I immediately encountered the social services coordinator passing by. I asked her the question I'd asked so many times it felt scripted. Any news about the removal? She glanced at her phone screen and responded with a vagueness I'd come to expect. They said this afternoon, but haven't confirmed an actual time. I just nodded my acknowledgement because here, when someone says this afternoon, it could mean today or tomorrow or never, depending on which department loses which form and which pile of paperwork. On day 22, I returned again early, unable to stay away, despite knowing what I'd find. The drawer bore that same fine film of water, but this time the moisture had tracked further down, nearly reaching the bottom edge of the metal front panel. I wiped it clean twice during the same visit, made my notation with growing concern. Just as I was preparing to leave the chamber, I heard that wooden creaking again, that sound that had become so familiar over these weeks. What if the boundary between the living and the dead is not as permanent as we've been taught to believe? What if bodies retain something we don't have instruments to measure, ... Do you ever sense presences that science cannot verify? Forces that operate outside the realm of what our training prepares us to handle? It was quick as always, over in seconds. But this time it sounded deeper somehow, heavier and more resonant. It wasn't frightening exactly. Wasn't the kind of sound that makes your hair stand up or your heart race. It just seemed tired, like waterlogged wood, groaning under pressure it was never designed to bear. Nothing more supernatural than physics and decay. When I made my log entry, I wrote, Day 22, water tracking lower, creaking sound deeper, possible internal settling. I used the word possible because I was unthere to make definitive claims about processes I could indirectly observe, only to document what reached my senses from outside that sealed container. Write in the comments something that begins with, I discovered that ... double quotes about a moment when you realized. The world operates by rules you don't fully understand, when the neat explanations you'd relied upon suddenly seemed inadequate. These discoveries, shared honestly in community space, remind us all that uncertainty is not weakness, but wisdom. That admitting we don't understand something is often more honest than clinging to comfortable lies. Your discovery might help someone else stop pretending they have it all figured out. Might give them permission to sit with mystery, instead of forcing false clarity. Late that afternoon, the coordinator stopped by and delivered new ID. Almost stopped believing ID here. The funeral service is coming tomorrow morning to collect him. I responded simply, Okay, understood. It was the first time in 3 weeks that anyone had given a specific time frame rather than vague promises. I noted in the margin of my log page. Removal scheduled. Day 23, morning hours. Day 23 arrived and I came in before anyone else, switching on lights in empty corridors, preparing myself for whatever this collection would reveal. I turned on the chamber lighting, verified temperature readings showing normal refrigeration levels. When I ran my hand across drawer 7's surface, I felt more accumulated moisture than I had on any previous day. It wasn't a huge amount, wasn't a flood, but it was enough to make the cleaning cloth noticeably heavier with absorbed water. The smell in the morgue area had also shifted into something I could no longer rationalize away. It wasn't the overwhelming rot of advanced decomposition. It wasn't the smell of exposed internal organs or ruptured intestines. It was more like a sick smell, stagnant and wrong, mixed with a distinct odor of saturated wood that's been wet far too long. Shortly after 9 in the morning, the funeral service finally arrived as promised. 2 men entered with a transport gurney and their professional equipment, moving with the efficiency of people who do this work daily. One of them checked the drawer number and confirmed, "This is the one we were here for." I opened the chamber door, released the locking mechanism on the track, and pulled slowly, revealing what 3 weeks of unexplained moisture had accomplished. The coffin was wet along its entire bottom surface, so thoroughly saturated that the cheap wood had darkened across more than half its area. The base had given way under accumulated weight and water damage, forming a downward bulge like a hammock stretched by something heavy resting in its center. And the body wasn't positioned where it should have been, wasn't in the configuration I'd documented when he first arrived. The head remained roughly aligned with where I'd placed it, but the torso and legs had somehow shifted forward approximately 30 centimeters, nearly touching the inner surface of the lid from inside. Technically, this shouldn't happen under any normal circumstances. Bodies in indigent coffins are positioned centrally and secured with simple fabric straps that prevent movement during transport. Without someone physically handling the body, without opening the coffin and repositioning things, it doesn't change location on its own. But there it was, undeniably displaced. Impossible to dismiss as imagination or measurement error. I couldn't claim it was absolutely impossible by the laws of physics, but I also had no ready explanation that satisfied basic logic about how inanimate objects behave. One of the funeral workers commented quietly, almost to himself, "This coffin is really wet, more than usual." His colleague responded with practical urgency, "Yeah, let's move quickly and get it loaded." They transferred the coffin to their transport gurney with care, trying not to stress the compromised structure. When they lifted it, the swollen wood at the bottom made a sharp cracking sound, and a small piece broke away completely, falling to the floor with a wet slap that echoed in the cold chamber. Neither of them commented on this failure, just continued with their task, as if coffins falling apart was routine. They secured the lid back in place, strapped everything down, and wheeled him out through the corridor toward their waiting vehicle. I remained standing there, looking at the now empty drawer, at the space he had occupied for 23 days. That felt like much longer. The metal track showed small rust spots where water had been dripping and pooling throughout all those days. I'd been documenting. I picked up my cleaning cloth, wiped the surface one final time, closed the drawer with a firm push, and wrote my last entry about this case in my logbook. Day 23. Removal completed. Bottom panel failed. Body displaced forward. Temperature maintained normal throughout storage period. Later that afternoon, I submitted my documentation record to the coordinator as required by our protocols. He read through it with his usual quick efficiency, then took his pen and crossed out several lines that I'd written about the condition of the coffin and body position. He looked up at me and said firmly, "Just note that it left the facility. If anyone asks questions, tell them everything was normal. Standard procedure throughout." I responded with the only answer available to me. "Understood. I'll handle it that way." I stored the logbook back in its place, returned to cleaning the other drawers that required maintenance, resuming the routines that define my working days. The motor of the chamber continued its constant hum exactly as before, steady and unchanging, as if nothing unusual had ever occurred in drawer 7, as if those 23 days of accumulating wrongness had been erased by his removal. The machinery doesn't care about mysteries or unanswered questions, doesn't pause to reflect on impossibilities. It just maintains temperature, cycles refrigerant through coils, preserves whatever we place inside its cold embrace until someone decides to take it away. And I learned once again what I had learned many times before in this profession. Some things happen that we re-expected to witness without acknowledging. Anomalies we document in personal notebooks but never in official reports. Truths that exist in the gap between what we observe and what we're permitted to say.